Hi, welcome to the Asia Climate Capital podcast. In each show, we tackle the business and finance trends of the energy transition and decarbonization in Asia, with the capital markets in mind. Please do send us comments or topic ideas to the Asia Climate Capital podcast at gmail.com. This will allow us to make sure the content is useful and relevant to you as well as other listeners. Welcome to episode 2 of the Asia Climate Capital podcast, recorded on the 15th of March 2022. I'm your host, Joseph Giacobelli. Today's guest is Mark Hutchinson. Mark is currently the chair of the Southeast Asia Task Force of the Global Wind Energy Council, or GWEC. GWEC, for those of you who don't know, is the International Trade Association for the wind power industry based in Brussels. And its members include all of the leaders and players in the wind industry, including companies like Vestas, Ørsted, Shell, Enel, and many others. Just a quick word about Mark's background, which is relatively unique. I mean, Mark is regarded as one of the energy sector thought leaders in the Asia-Pacific region. Prior to GWEC, Mark worked for several international consultancies, including Wood Mackenzie, IHS Sierra, which is now under S&P. He also worked for corporates, including his very first job for a utility back in the United States, and also worked in investment banking as well. So he's incredibly well-rounded in the sector. Apart from that, he has been in the region for almost 30 years. So here's my conversation with Mark. Hi, welcome to the Asia Climate Capital podcast. And today we have, as mentioned, Mark Hutchinson. And so I'll just dive in right into asking him some questions. So Mark, you've been involved in the energy transition in Asia for quite some time. Could you tell us a little bit how your journey to specializing in the energy transition side of the industry came about?
Good morning, Joseph. Thanks for having me on your podcast. My journey started out of just pure logic. The energy transition was becoming more and more obvious. And if I did not sort of get into the industry from that side, I could see that I was going to be on the wrong side of history. So around 4 or 5 years ago, when I was at Wood Mackenzie, I had been doing various bits and pieces in renewables, but then I was offered the opportunity to lead the energy transition consulting practice, and I jumped at it.
So, from your many decades of experience, how do you think that, and this is more like on the job front for people who want to get into it, to get into the sector, how do you think that a fresh university graduate or a seasoned professional should get involved in this new multi-trillion-dollar market?
It's a great time to be a recent grad, just because this sector is exploding everywhere from, just ESG investing to, consulting to working for a developer. But recent grads have just almost endless opportunities to get involved. So I would just suggest that they do some research, find out what companies are doing what, find out what part of the market interests them, be it consulting, finance, working in sustainability for corporate, and then go for it. A search on sustainability in LinkedIn job market will bring you thousands of responses. So I'd say go for it. Professionals, I've had a number of professionals reach out to me, and actually yesterday I got a very nice message on LinkedIn from somebody I'd spoken to 3 years ago and counseled them on how to get into the energy transition space. You may have to take a little bit of a step backwards. If you say you're in the oil and gas industry and you want to move into something that's more sustainable in the energy transition, You may have to take potentially a step backwards in salary. But again, if you want to do what you're passionate about, money's important, but it's not always the top of the list. And I would just say that you got to take a little bit of risk and go for it.
Right. I think, I guess part of it is the kind of education dimension of it all. I mean, you can do some kind of specific training, etc. But I do think that it's personally, I think it's a great opportunity to get into this multi-trillion-dollar market, especially in Asia.
One thing. Another thing you can do is volunteer. A former colleague reached out to me last year. I worked with the Global Wind Energy Council, and asked, she's a gas professional, and asked, what can I do to get involved? And she said, I'll volunteer. I'll do it for free. So while she was doing her full-time job, she actually did some volunteer work for some research, and filled out her resume that way. And like you said, there's also a lot of certificate programs that you can get while you're working full-time that will give you a good foundation for getting into the industry.
Great. From a business and finance opportunities angle, if you were to choose, and I know you know the whole of Asia, and you've worked in many of the different markets, but and different types of fuel types as well. But if you were to choose just one single sub-industry in the whole energy sector, which area would you pick?
Well, I am slightly biased because I'm in the wind industry, but I would pick offshore wind. Offshore wind is growing very, very rapidly across the globe and in Asia. Countries that are developing offshore wind markets are Korea, Japan, Taiwan's already well advanced, Vietnam, ultimately Philippines as well. And the thing with offshore wind is, they're not $50 million projects. A small offshore wind project is $500 million. And so you get into these very large scale projects. They take a lot of preparation work. It takes a lot of regulatory work to get the lenders comfortable. So there's just huge opportunities coming up over the next 3, 5, 10 years.
And could you run through, obviously, not over an hour or a day or a week, because there's a lot of stuff happening, but could you run through the various developments in recent years in the offshore wind industry market, again, from a business and finance angle?
Sure. I mean, first of all, offshore wind is attractive because it's the closest that you can really come to kind of base load. The wind blows offshore much more than it blows onshore. It's much more predictable. You can look at it by season and by day. And so as a resource, it's very attractive. And so it's also offshore. It's out of sight generally. So you don't have some of the not in my backyard issues that you get with the onshore. You still have to deal with fisheries and marine planning, so shipping lanes and defense. But those issues can be addressed. And so from a business point of view, the high capacity factor, all of the net zero commitments make it attractive to businesses, right? With Korea's net zero commitment, Vietnam's net zero commitment, countries are going to have to do a lot. And offshore wind is one thing that can really deliver. So when when you have these targets, you have these commitments from the governments, ultimately the policies and regulations follow, and then the businesses follow that, and then the financiers follow the developers that go into these markets. So it's a chain reaction, well advanced in some places, a little less advanced in others.
So what actually have been the kind of key developments, stepping stones in the last, you said the wind market has been kind of blowing up, excuse the pun, for the last, 5 years or so. What have been some of the kind of, stepping stones or some of the kind of key industry events that you've seen in the last few years?
Well, I think proof of concept is a critical one, and that's what's happened in Europe. So if you take Northwest Europe, where the offshore wind market is very mature, countries in Asia have seen that, so there's a very strong set of evidence that shows what can be done, what can be delivered, cost reductions that can be achieved, capacity factors, predictability. And so to me, that's just absolutely key. Most times when new technologies come to market, you have multi-year, test periods, but that's all been done in Northwest Europe. So, you tick all of these boxes that the lenders are looking for. So to me, that's just the key enabler. And then also just, again, I'll go back, all these net zero commitments, all the focus on sustainability investing, all of these things are just key drivers to make this move forward.
And just on the same point, Mark, what do you think that China's role has been, and what China's role will be in offshore wind, given that they're planning tens of gigawatts? I mean, more gigawatts than anybody else. So do you think it's going to be a fairly insulated market?
China is the largest single offshore wind market in the world. It's roughly the same size as all of Europe, and it dwarfs everything else in Asia now. But as we get towards the end of the decade, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam will start to catch up. The Chinese wind market is somewhat insular. There's not a lot of foreign players involved. In fact, I don't know of any significant foreign players that are involved in the Chinese market, and the Chinese do not appear to be that heavily involved in the other markets in Asia so far. But again, this all may change just given the scale of China's industrial resource and capabilities.
Right. So within the offshore wind industry, if you were to just pick one, jurisdiction, one single power market, which market would it be, and why?
Taiwan is reasonably well advanced in its offshore market. Korea and Japan, Japan just had an auction in December that had some somewhat surprising results. One developer won all three bids. I think the most interesting one is Vietnam, and again, the Prime Minister's commitment to net zero at COP26, late last year, has been an absolute catalyst for change in Vietnam. And the Power Development Plan 8 that is in draft form, and literally 2 days ago they released a new draft version, which increased even more the amount of offshore wind. So I think Vietnam has an amazing offshore wind resource. So you're going to see a lot of development come there. All the key players are in Vietnam right now, and the government is committed to net zero and is making some very impressive changes. So I think it's a really interesting market to watch. Still a lot of work to do, but you're going to see some massive developments online by 2030.
So you mentioned that a lot of the there's a lot of the big players are already there. Taking out your crystal ball, do you think that there will be some major players, be it developers, be it private equity firms, who are going to drive the offshore wind projects business in Vietnam and perhaps elsewhere in the region?
Absolutely. I mean, just because the offshore wind industry started in Europe, it really is the European players that have sort of jumped the gun and are the first movers. But you're also starting to see, regional players trying to get into the market, and just because of the technical nature and the scale. Offshore wind tends to favor the experienced developers. But what you get is experienced developers want to share some of the risk, so they will bring in equity partners or local partners who have good government connections, capabilities on the ground to deliver port services or whatever it is. But it is really the European players that have been sort of key drivers to get these markets started. The Mitsubishi won the Japanese auction, but they also have experience in Europe in offshore wind. So again, they're bringing that European, even though they're Japanese, they're bringing that experience from Europe back to Asia.
And just kind of to shift gears a little bit and just looking at the investment or finance side of things, could you tell us a little bit about the different kind of returns in key offshore wind markets in the region? I know it's a very, very big topic, and it differs quite. The returns differ by project, by country, by promoter. So of course, taking into consideration different revenue models, could you tell us a little bit what different kind of returns in key offshore wind energy markets in the region we're seeing?
Yeah, again, it depends whether or not you're an early stage developer, or you're a pension fund that buys in at after the project's been de-risked and is operational. But if you get in early, you take some of the development risk. You're looking at 20% plus returns if you sell down close to COD or after COD to pension funds and others. So it can be very attractive. Of course, the pension funds like it because, again, it's ESG investing. The off-takers tend to be pretty highly rated. And so mostly it's considered a de-risked asset, although there have been a little bit of challenges lately in Taiwan. Some of the projects are over budget and facing a few delays. So, the investors don't like that. But, it is a new market. So it's to be expected that there'll be a few bumps in the road. But in general, again, it completely depends when you enter into the project. Early stage development gets you much higher returns.
Could you tell us a little bit about the kind of prevalent business models, revenue models, I should say, in offshore wind markets in Asia?
Well, you're getting let's just take Taiwan. You're getting a feed-in tariff if you were in the early projects, and that's a 20-year, I believe, PPA, and with Thai Power. So it's very much like a utility sort of business model, and so it's like a bond, and that's why a lot of the pension funds and other infrastructure funds like it, because it gets long, predictable revenue. We haven't seen any. We've seen one project in Taiwan that has a 920 megawatt corporate PPA. So again, it's a huge off-taker, and so the off-taker has very high credit rating. So again, it's kind of like a utility investment. As we see these projects come into other markets, the Philippines has a wholesale power market. So how they're going to actually implement, feed-in tariffs or whatever for offshore wind is yet to be seen. But again, most of these things once they're operational, they're considered sort of utility-style business models.
So once you have your PPA, you kind of locked in a tariff, say, pick a number, say 25 cents US per kilowatt hour or whatever. Given the amazing disruptions we're getting from Putin's war right now, supply chain disruptions, expectations of very, very high inflation, higher interest rates, etc. Is that going to kind of hurt the current projects, the projects that are already signed PPAs? Are they going to see some very? Are there like some kind of ways, some inflation adjustments that can be done later on, or how do you see that situation? I know it's very, very complicated, and there's a lot of factors, that variables we don't know yet. But and it's a very, very tough question. But I love to ask you tough questions.
Yeah, that's an extremely difficult question. The most immediate impact you're seeing is if you think about you're an OEM and you're supplying a turbine, you signed a contract 2 years ago to deliver the turbine, say this year, and install it. You made your bids in a different commodity world, in a different inflation world, in a different logistics world, And so there's a lot. I mean, you can just look on LinkedIn to some of the posts by the OEMs, and they're showing some pain. So their margins have been hit very hard. But again, it's a different world that we're living in. Some of the PPAs can have inflation adjustment factors, whether or not they're fixed or whether they're tied to some sort of index. If they're tied to an index, that gives you some protection. But yes, absolutely, high inflation, supply chain challenges are bad for sort of utility bond type structures.
But again, looking at it, one of the things I've been discussing with people also is to kind of almost separate. I mean, what is going on now is absolutely horrendous and horrible. But also, when we talk about the energy transition, we're talking about something which is evolutionary, is going to happen over the next 30 years. And what is happening now, hopefully, is not something which is going to be lasting a decade. Even the worst predictions are talking about 2-3 years out. So how do you see kind of like the time frame from your perspective?
You mean on things getting back to normal? As far as if I knew that, Joseph, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. I would be retired on a beach somewhere because I would be able to predict. I honestly don't know. 6 months ago, I would have thought it was just a surge in demand post-COVID. But whether or not it's something more structural, I don't know. But it seems to be lasting longer than a lot of people thought. And again, inflation is bad for business predictability, especially when we were in a exceptionally low inflationary period, and now all of a sudden we're in a huge spike. Very hard to predict. So, just to be very clear, prices in the wind industry are going up, not down. So for many years, they were going down, down, down. And now we're on what's probably, a slightly temporary up, but we don't know whether that temporary is 6 months or 3 years.
Right, but it doesn't take away your bullishness on the offshore wind market over the long term, meaning 5-10 years.
Absolutely. No, absolutely not, because, coal is going away. Coal is dying. It's basically dead. Gas is going to get increasingly more difficult to invest in. From a gas-fired power plant has a technical life of 25 years, and if you think about 25 years from now, that's pushing 2050 with all these net zero commitments. So your plant is going to just increasingly see lower load factors every year. The value of gas plants is going to be in its capacity, not in its base load. To make up for when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining. So, your revenue models have to, for gas, have to be fixed to capacity payments because you're just going to run less and less and less. So, and more investors are backing away from any hydrocarbon investing. So I just don't see an alternative but more solar, more wind, more batteries, for example, and hydrogen ultimately.
Obviously 300% agree with you. And the other factor is when people are talking about recently these supply chains and inflationary pressures, et cetera, bringing up the cost of solar, bringing up the cost of wind. But then, when you compare it to the fossil fuel prices, actually that gap is even more attractive than it's ever been because, gas prices, LNG prices around the region, coal prices in the region have gone through the roof. I haven't run the calculations, but I'm sure that price gap must be absolutely humongous, probably the highest it's ever been.
Yeah, no, it's huge. It will all depend on your contracting structure for your coal or gas. But yeah, it's the comparators. People are. I'm dealing with one situation now where we're trying to influence a situation where the price of offshore wind is being compared to the price of coal a year ago. And that's just not a valid comparison. As you said, coal has gone up, 2 to 5 times, depending on your contracting structure.
Yeah, and those prices are, because of the reasons we mentioned, unlikely to come down in the short term too. So obviously exactly. that brings some pressure. So is there much appetite again, talking about the whole finance side of things, is there much appetite from domestic commercial financial institutions or international commercial financial institutions in lending money to offshore wind projects?
Well, just like any new market, getting lenders comfortable with the risks. So, for example, if you look at offshore wind, say in Taiwan, the domestic lenders had obviously never invested or went to offshore wind, so they had to get comfortable with it. And it's always a process. And the better the structuring of the project, the easier it is to finance, the better the supporting regulations, the clarity of the regulations, the easier it is to get the finance. So yeah, ultimately, we expect domestic lenders to be involved. But just given the scale of these projects, we also expect international lenders to stay involved in places like Vietnam. In Japan, obviously, they have huge capital markets, so it's not clear how many international lenders will be involved, but I'm guessing there still will be some.
Digging into your thoughts there, in your experience, what's the key factors that commercial lenders will be looking at when it comes to these offshore wind projects? Could you dig into that a little bit?
Yeah, well, they want to see a developer who's done it before, because these are pretty complex projects. So they want to see, and unlike, a traditional gas or coal plant or even an onshore, you don't have a full EPC wrap. It's not typically one contractor that's responsible for the entire project. So they tend to be split up. So developers who've done that before are very important, right, for lenders to get comfortable. You also want to see, again, the regulations. What are the termination clauses? What are the arbitration clauses? What's the creditworthiness of the off-taker? Fairly typical sort of PPA or standard project finance clauses apply. But yeah, I don't really see lack of finance as an issue. I see in places like Vietnam, I see the lack of clarity in the government regulations as a much bigger challenge.
And talking about that, and I'll just make a statement and just to see if you agree or not. I think one of the things that people in the finance industry have to understand is number one, this is relatively new by kind of energy types. And number two, it takes a while for the whole value chain of the people involved, the whole ecosystem, to really get familiar with the pluses, the minuses, etc. And so, as you mentioned earlier, it is an industry which is in Asia, been booming maybe for the last 3, 4, 5 years or so. So there's still a long way to go compared to like utility solar projects, which now are coming out at an incredible pace, especially in China, where they can build gigawatts of solar in just a few weeks. So I think again, going back to the education factor, there's a lot of education that needs to be done. It needs to be undertaken at the lenders level, at the investor level, so to understand where this industry is coming from. So just a couple of comments, which I'm not sure if you agree with all that.
Yeah, again, it's a new industry for most countries in Asia, right? And that's why, like I said earlier, the proof of concept out of Europe is so critical, right? If I would think that what's happening in Asia would not be happening if it hadn't already happened to such an extent in Europe, right? If we were really just pioneering offshore wind in Asia, it would be taking longer than it is, right? Because the banks, the investors can't look at a very successful offshore wind market in Europe and go, oh, hey, that's already done, tick that box. Oh, those developers are all coming over to Asia, bringing their expertise. Oh, yeah. So if that didn't happen, already in Europe, it wouldn't be happening here, the speed at which it's happening.
Great. Have multilateral financial organizations such as, I don't know, Asia Development Bank, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank out of Beijing, played any role in the development of the offshore wind industry in Vietnam and elsewhere, knowing that this is a kind of like a newer industry? So, you expect some kind of support?
Yeah, you're seeing, World Bank is active in sort of developing roadmaps for, they've done it in Vietnam, they're doing it in the Philippines. We at GWEC have what's called a finance working group, where we have various export credit agencies, commercial banks, and domestic banks in Vietnam that we are trying to work with the government and other stakeholders to sort of help them understand what the financiers want to see in a project, structure-wise, supporting regulations, et cetera, to be able to mobilize the type of finance that's needed. So you're going to see, sort of these, concessional finance come in the early stages of these markets, just, as it always does, to, bring the comfort to the commercial banks and, help leverage the domestic banks. Because in a market like Vietnam, the domestic banks will very quickly bump up against sector limits or, single lender limits. So it's inevitable you're going to have the international financiers, and they like to see ECAs, multilaterals, et cetera, come in for support.
Great. Fantastic. Look, I really, really enjoyed the conversation, and obviously your breadth and the breadth and depth of your knowledge is absolutely amazing. So really, really appreciate your time, and hopefully we'll do this sometime again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Joseph. Have a good day.
I trust you found the conversation useful. As always, feedback is really key, and in order to make the content useful and relevant to you and other listeners, please do give us some feedback. Also, please like the podcast in whatever podcast app you use, and send us your comments, your thoughts, your ideas for topics anytime at the Asia Climate Capital Podcast at gmail.com. That's the Asia Climate Capital Podcast at gmail.com. Thank you.